Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
Jill had approached her front door, holding her shopping, and when the attacker stepped behind her, forced her to the ground and fired a single round from a handgun into the left side of her head, just above her ear. It had the hallmarks of a professional killing. It's thought that she was killed instantly.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
In this double episode, a notorious case which dominated the headlines in 1999 and left both the police and the public grappling for answers. The shocking murder of Jill Dando, one of Britain's best-loved television presenters and host of Crimewatch, remains unsolved. We'll discuss Jill Dando's remarkable life, the events leading up to her murder, and the initial investigation. We'll also be talking to former Detective Chief Superintendent Hamish Campbell, who led the investigation and oversaw the controversial conviction of Barry George, a conviction that was later overturned. He'll explain the twists and turns of the inquiry, and in part 2, we'll explore what went wrong with the case against Barry George and what DCS Campbell thinks now about who may have killed Jill Dando. Jill Dando's murder was so shocking that many people remember where they were and what they were doing when they heard the news. I was actually in Barbados, of all places, filming a holiday series for ITV, recording links at a golf course, and the producer waited for us to finish the final piece of filming because she was worried that perhaps I knew Jill well, which I didn't, but naturally that I would be shocked, which I was.
I have a very vivid memory of learning of what had happened. I was sitting in my office in Westminster, waiting for something to happen, for a story to drop into my lap. And boy, what a big story this was.
Well, you were at Sky News at the time, and you were the first to break the news of Jill Dando's death. Tell us about that day, Martin, the 26th of April, 1999.
I remember it was a slow news morning. But that's the erratic nature of my job. You can go from boredom to shock in seconds. I got a call, a tip-off from a very good source of mine. A woman, he said, had been stabbed in Gowan Avenue in Fulham. She might be dead and she might be Jill Dando. The source said that the police hadn't yet arrived at the scene. So the first thing I did was to go on the computer and log on to the electoral roll, this public document that shows you where people live. And I looked up the name Jill Dando, never thinking that I would find her because a lot of celebrities choose not to have their name on this public document. And lo and behold, her name popped up. She lived at 29 Gowan Avenue. So already I was beginning to think that this was a potentially huge story. We quickly got a team together. I raced downstairs and jumped into my cameraman's car, and we shot off to Fulham.
Jill Dando was a popular, much-loved household name in 1990s Britain, Martin, but perhaps some of our younger listeners might not grasp the sense of shock that a tip-off like this would have had. Just explain who Jill was.
Well, for a start, she was the most unlikely murder victim. I thought that at the time, and I still think it. She was a TV presenter, a hugely familiar face on our screens in the 1990s. She was at the height of her fame. In April 1999, she was 37 years old, the host of BBC One's holiday programme, and also, ironically perhaps, Crimewatch UK. She was also an advocate for various charities, causes like cancer research and child welfare. She was something rather like, I suppose, a TV version of Princess Diana, who had died 2 years earlier. Jill Dando had been named BBC Personality of the Year the previous year. That's a clue to her popularity. According to her BBC colleague Kate Adie, who was asked to comment soon after this terrible news broke, Jill Dando didn't have an enemy in the world. Well, clearly she did have at least one enemy. Friends described her as a vivacious and down-to-earth woman with a laugh that could fill a room. She was engaged to Alan Farthing, a prominent gynaecologist, and she was planning their wedding. So Jill Dando's life seemed full of promise, which made all of that happened on that day even more incomprehensible.
Minutes after that tip-off, Martin, you jumped in your cameraman's car, you headed off to Gowan Avenue. What did you see? What was the scene that greeted you when you arrived? Very, very early doors, it has to be said.
As a journalist, I think I was ahead of the game that morning, but of course, by the time I got there, and it's a few miles from our central London office, we couldn't get near number 29. The police had arrived, cordoned off both ends of the street, a street of pretty two-storey Victorian terraced houses. I was on the phone constantly to press officers at Scotland Yard, and they confirmed, strictly unofficially, that the victim was indeed Jill Dando. I made a call to another Scotland Yard press officer a bit later, and with luck on my side, and I mean luck in terms of being a journalist looking for the inside track on a story, the person I spoke to when I made that call was reading a screen with internal police messages on it, and he confirmed that she'd died. It was involuntary, really. He was just repeating what he was looking at on the screen. And I went on the air with the news. I'd first reported that Jill Dando had been injured, and then not long after, I reported that she'd died, and I would only have done that after some consultation with my news desk. And I absolutely believe today that with a greater focus on privacy that we have, we are more concerned about the impact such news has on family members. We would have waited for official confirmation from the police or the victim's family. But in those years, in 1999, with Sky News known for its tagline, "First for breaking news," I reported it immediately, or almost immediately, and was the first to break the story on telly. I learned later that the BBC made a formal complaint that Sky had broadcast the tragic details too early, and I think that's fair. Before we could be certain that all her family had been made aware of her death. And I do specifically remember that Jill's brother Nigel worked as a journalist in Bristol, and he had been in his newspaper newsroom watching the tragic details unfold and may well have watched me breaking the news to him that his sister had died. And I can only imagine the impact that must have had on him.
That must have been very difficult. I suppose, though, if another journalist from another channel had the same information and your information seemed very credible, would have probably done the same thing. Let's talk through, if we may, what we know about that morning and the moments leading up to Jill's death. She'd spent the night at her fiancé's home in Chiswick, left there at around 9 a.m. for her house, popping to some shops on the way, and Jill arrived home at about 11:30. What then, Martin?
Well, I first reported that she'd been stabbed. That's what my source had said, and I think that was the first police understanding from initial reports of people who'd found her. She wasn't stabbed, of course, she'd been shot. But there were no eyewitnesses to the murder. Police believed initially, I think, and certainly it was a very strong theory, that this was an execution-style killing. Jill had approached her front door, holding her shopping, and when the attacker stepped behind her, forced her to the ground and fired a single round from a handgun into the left side of her head, just above her ear. It had the hallmarks of a very clinical, professional killing, and it's thought that she was killed instantly. There was a lot of blood, but the bullet passed out of the other side of her head, so her face was intact, which I guess made those first arriving absolutely sure that it was Jill Dando. There was a next-door neighbour, Richard Hughes, who said he'd heard a scream from Jill. He said, "I thought it was someone surprising somebody." Oddly, he hadn't heard a gunshot. Hughes had looked out of his front window and, while not realising what had happened, made the only certain sighting of the killer. He said it was a 6-foot-tall white man, aged around 40, dark hair, and a man who was walking briskly away from Dando's house. At just after 11:45, I think, over about 10 minutes past the shooting, her body was found by another neighbour, Helen, and she said she was lying in a strange position and there was a lot of blood. Her hand was blue, and from the way she looked, I knew she was dead. It all looked very professional. The police were called immediately, of course, and Jill was formally pronounced dead on arrival at Charing Cross Hospital at 3 minutes past 1. The ambulance didn't have far to travel to take her to the hospital. The Metropolitan Police launched a murder investigation, Operation Oxborough, which became one of the biggest homicide investigations conducted by the Met. The biggest investigation since the Yorkshire Ripper. It was spearheaded by Team 2 of the Met Police's Central Area Major Investigation Pool. Too much of a mouthful for most of us. We very quickly nicknamed it the Dando Squad, and even the commissioner at the time called it the Dando Squad.
The senior investigating officer who led the Dando Squad was Hamish Campbell. He spent 39 years in the Met, most of those years investigating serious crime, retiring as a detective chief superintendent. And he joins us now. Hamish, welcome to True Criminals. We're really delighted to have you with us.
Thank you. Pleasure. Nice to see you both.
And you. It's been a long time. Hamish, can you take us back to that day? You arrived at the scene shortly after the first officers, I think. Do you remember what you felt?
Well, I do. I think I remember almost all the scenes I go to for murder or used to, but that one in particular, it was a fortnight of on-call for the West London side, and it was the second week of being on call. There hadn't actually been a reported murder for our team to deal with in the first week, so this was the Monday of the second week. The first I recall of it vividly is being informed that there was a report of a woman had been stabbed in Fulham. Ordinarily, I wouldn't necessarily have gone straight to that sort of scene, but there hadn't been anything for the first week. And I said, all right, well, let's go down there rather than sending the detective sergeant to the others to make a preliminary assessment of it. So he drove me down there. And I recall as we drove down, whichever road it was, the Fulham Road, I got a call from the chief superintendent, my detective chief superintendent, saying, you're going to that scene, are you? I said, yes. And he told me, he said, well, just to let you know, we think it's Jill Dando, maybe Jill Dando who's been killed. Which I thought then, well, that's extraordinary and surprising, because in fact, just the week before, 2 weeks before, we had all been to the Crimewatch celebration, 25 years as a Crimewatch, at a luncheon at Scotland Yard, where she and obviously Nick Ross and many others were present. So it just seemed extraordinary at that level. I said, okay, well, we're on our way down. And then an ambulance drove past us, going the other way to obviously the Fulham Hospital or the Charing Cross Hospital on its sirens, which I guess then that must be whoever has been killed in the ambulance. And so then we arrived at the scene, and very quickly the scene was cordoned off at the top end of Gowan Avenue and way down the other end of Fulham Road. So we brought that further cordon in. And then the constables at the scene, the police officers from Fulham, said, so I think this is Jill Dando. And I said, well, how sure are we really that it's Jill Dando? No one was absolutely 100% sure, but I could recognize that it probably was, but I didn't know this is where she lived. And we needed positive identification before we released that. So it was all happening very fast. And this scene, not only was it a murder scene, which in itself creates its own tensions and dynamics, to them having the background immediately, it was Jill Dando, added a further dimension to the instant scene at that time.
Hamish, how did you go about investigating such a high-profile murder?
Well, in one way, sticking to the principles of homicide investigation. I used to write, there's a risk of going outside of the processes, the good standard processes. So, yes, you have to deal with clearing the ground beneath your feet. You have to do the crime scene. You have to do immediate witnesses. You have to do all that immediate trawl for the evidence, which you know is going to rapidly disappear. So even in those first minutes, hour, I knew that what we had to do was a rapid identification of witnesses. The two witnesses had already been identified by the local CID, who had obviously turned up. And those two witnesses, Mr. Hughes and Mr. Upfill Brown, Mr. Upfill Brown is now dead, were the only two witnesses who were ever they never changed. There was no other additional witness, because those two saw a man leaving the gateway of Jill Dando's house. So getting those and then doing rapid house to house immediately and then instantaneous searching. A lot of resources was poured in, as would be normal, it doesn't matter who it was at the time, to go down the road and see if anything could be observed in the searching. But after that initial flurry of crime scene attendance, preservation, and then all the scientists come along and look for blood, forensics, any other exhibits, which can take days. Then you're into the long haul of the investigation and how you're going to manage this. If it wasn't Jill Dando and that had been a street shooting or a stabbing, which we've done many of, myself and my colleagues and the team, that would have been a more straightforward. We'd go through principles and processes. So you try to adopt that to this case. But of course, what happened with Jill Dando's case is that there was so much information. Everyone had a view. That's fair enough, having a view. And then everyone had an idea as who was responsible. And so you get hundreds and hundreds, in the end, thousands of phone calls, identifying people, suggesting people, nominating people. And all that is coming into the major incident room at a pace which is almost unmanageable. I was running that team, and my colleague, Chief Inspector, was also running another team. And most of the murders we were dealing with were being solved very quickly. Some of them weren't immediately identifiable as suspects. But we could normally solve a murder within 2 to 3 weeks. Most murders, of course, are being committed by people whom we know and love. It's rare to have the complete stranger and no association between victim and suspect. So it's you try to stick with the principles of the investigation and get your evidence, because we all know evidence will be lost very, very quickly. So that's CCTV, that's eyewitnesses, recovery of statements, their exhibits. A whole range of things need to be done. And then you have to start doing the investigation with what you have got. What do the facts tell us? What does the immediate evidence tell us? All right, what do you do from now?
The investigation, Hamish, became one of the most exhaustive in British criminal history. I think you're already giving us an indication of that. Can you talk us through, as far as you can remember, the numbers and the work that was involved initially?
If I had all my logs with me, probably could. The numbers, I sometimes they do say it was an enormous investigation, which of course it was. But, I was a detective sergeant for a few years on the anti-terrorist branch at the days when IRA were bombing. And some of the investigations there were enormous as well. In fact, counter-terrorist branch, as it was then back in the 90s, was the first unit in London to be using the Holmes major inquiry system. That's where I learned the craft of the Holmes database. Historically, everything was on card and paper, like you just talked about earlier. Everything was paper driven and little cards. So it was a large inquiry, and certainly as far as the central London murder teams were concerned, of which there were 6, it was the largest homicide for years over it. And at the trial, we had to set out the scale of the homicide investigation in terms of witnesses. I think it was over 2,500 witness statements, hundreds and hundreds of people seen, thousands of cars having to be traced and identified, both just from, as an example, Gowan Avenue, which is where, of course, Jill lived and was killed. Every car in that road was identified, photographed, car numbers. And then just in that one street, both sides, identify every owner, see them. So, because some of them weren't actually living in the street, they were visiting or whatever. So just that one example of, all right, now trace and identify these owners, and then find the missing gaps in that street, which is what we did. I remember the gap outside Jill Dando's house. She had parked her car directly outside her house, which we thought at the time, that's a remarkable coincidence or just chance. Because, London streets are busy. Every residential street is busy. And the chance of parking outside your address is fortunate, isn't it? Everyone loves to be able to park outside their address. So here she was at 11:30 in the morning turning up, and there's a space directly there. So we wanted to know who was, for instance, parked in that space immediately before she arrived. So we did find out. We laboriously went through every single car hopping that morning to find the car that moved out, because there was a suggestion or belief or consideration. Maybe that was the killer's car. Maybe she'd been followed so sophisticatedly that they'd seen her arrive, they'd pulled out their own car, and then she was able to slot her own car in. So that's the sort of detail that we went into. But we're into numbers of thousands. When we got to the stage, all right, let us look at individuals, because he's been nominated by any number of people, internally, police structures or outside. One person could be eliminated within half an hour a day. Other people, if we got information which looked promising or interesting, could take weeks and weeks and weeks. But in the end, we had over 2,000 people nominated, either by us or the public, who might have been involved or were involved. So you have to say to yourself, well, what are we going to do with all these people? How do we sift them? So I'd set out with others, it wasn't just me sitting on my own, but what is our criteria? That's what you have to do with stranger homicide. What is your criteria for eliminating people or going to visit them? You must have a priority. Otherwise, the team will be thinking, well, where do we go now, sir? Who do we follow? So that's what we set out. The obvious one is, well, they're going to be male, aren't they? All right, what age are they going to be? And what age group are we going to do? We're not going to visit anybody below 15. I'm giving examples, not beyond 50 years old. They're not going to be blonde haired. Then the next question is, well, they could be wearing a wig, sir. Well, they could be. They could be completely bald and wearing a wig. They could actually be blonde and dyed it dark. But you have to have parameters to set out, to sift out people at the start.
Hamish, you said that you look what the evidence shows you and then you decide what to do. From my memories of that case, just as a reporter and a journalist, I didn't think that there was an awful lot that the scene gave you. But talking about how quickly normally you solve murders, did you think you'd get a breakthrough quite quickly?
Yes, I did. 2 reasons. One, because I don't know why I thought most murders are solved quickly. We tend to solve them quickly. They're the police of society. We know generally who's killed. And when I was leaving London in the Met 2013, when I was overseeing the homicide teams, I used to recognize that out of the 24 homicide teams, most murders, when reported, we knew within 24 hours who was responsible. Doesn't mean you arrested them. Doesn't mean you got hold of them. But you had a very clear idea. And then that small percentage subset where you thought, no, you've caught a sticker here, I'm afraid. You really are in a stranger world. This one, I thought it was high profile and somehow seemed it was going to fall easily into our laps in terms of the individual was going to be identified quickly for a witness or CCTV. And then we thought fingerprints. And in that very first week, fingerprints were found on the door. So if you look at a front door on the left-hand side, left hand leaning against the door, and they were good marks. And I remember thinking, well, there's a good example. And everyone assured us, no, the scene was frozen. There's the tapes. No one's been in. But I don't mean this in any way derogatory. It turned out it was the constable's fingerprints. The constable had no recollection of doing that. In the trauma and the high drama, he had entered the scene, which he would have to do. He'd have to go and look. But he leaned over. And in order to lean over to look in, he put his hand up on the door. So we spent some 2 weeks. We said, well, obviously we fingerprint all the officers who come into the scene. And sure enough, it was his fingerprints. So that's an example of thinking, oh, there's some fingerprints. Then there was another set of fingerprints somewhere else, down on a lamppost, eliminated. Then, of course, we had the gun. The gun was the key piece of forensic material left there. We know, obviously, that belonged to the killer. What work could be done immediately and in the future on the weapon, and the further forensic on the residue. But that's later down the line. But was there any other immediate? There was no immediate testing for DNA. Nothing could be really perceived. That's where we're left. Many other scenes would have a lot. But of course, this scene, unfortunately, was heavily contaminated by the attempts to resuscitate, the preservation of life by the ambulance service. But Jill Dando was definitely dead. And there were 3 doctors on the scene. And we have video. It was never shown at court. But we have the video of the HEMS team, the helicopter emergency services. They took video of the scene on their arrival and, a lot of work and everything else going on. But they obviously massively contaminated any possibility of recovery, whether it be fibers, further additional firearms residue, DNA. That was all gone. So we're left with a very empty forensic scene.
In addition to co-hosting True Criminals, Helen hosts her own award-winning podcast, The Convex Conversation. If you're eager to learn more about the inspiring guests she interviews, from royalty to astronauts, from industry leaders to explorers, check it out at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours.
And if you're curious to dive deeper into Martin's work as a crime reporter, I had the pleasure of interviewing him about his book, No One Got Cracked Over the Head for No Reason, Dispatches from a Crime Reporter, on my podcast. In this episode, Martin shares some gripping stories that resonate with the themes we explore here on True Criminals. You can find links to that episode in our show notes or on the True Criminals page at audiobleachglobal.com.
The paradox of the murder was that the method of killing seemed professional. I remember one detective telling me that professional contract killers are often OBE. I don't know whether you're familiar with that phrase. One behind the ear, close to the head, clinical, like this one. And yet the weapon wasn't professional. And I remember interviewing a man called Ian Tucker, who'd been a suspect. He was interviewed by a couple of your detectives because he'd featured as a wanted man on Crimewatch twice, actually, on programmes that Jill Dando had presented. He was later ruled out because he had an alibi. But he told me that he'd never use what he called an unprofessional 9mm gun, which often jams. A revolver, he said, was more reliable because it doesn't spit out a cartridge which is left behind as evidence. In fact, you had a cartridge, didn't you?
Yes.
And you wrote about this paradox in one of your early diary entries, I remember.
I did. This debate internally, the investigation, was it the single person, loner, someone self-motivated, or the professional hit? And of course, the media followed this extraordinarily strongly. Now, there were some parts of the media which are absolutely adamant that the Met and Campbell and else got it wrong. And right from the early days, of course, it was a contract killing or an organized assassination, whether it be from the Serbians, the Russians, the Crimewatch world, or was it just something else? And that weapon and the approach, there were two conflicting approaches. The person who was seen walking away from the scene was doing just that, walking, not running, and was not wearing gloves, was not masked up, was not wearing a helmet as if they were going to jump into a little motorbike on the back of a motorbike somewhere else. But there were no motorbikes seen in that street whatsoever.
And done in broad daylight.
It was broad daylight as well, indeed. And there seems to be no concern of identification or risk by the professional, whatever we understand by the professional killer. And then add to that scenario, the method of shooting was to approach the victim so closely to put the gun to the side of the head and fire, which also introduced, had we caught him at the time, the complete contamination and splash black of any blood. So that would be an odd thing, because how do they know they weren't going to be caught if that was the case? Without someone not thinking through, if that's the plan, let's go and assassinate and execute Jill, whatever motivation, this is what we'll do. We don't know where she lives, but hey, we'll just wait till she turns up, sort of thing. But it's the gun, come back to your point, the gun, single cartridge through an unrifled barrel of a pistol, which therefore means it wasn't a 9mm Glock, Smith & Wesson, and all the other weapons. So why would you, out of all the things, why would the assassin is only left, or the professional killer is only left with one gun? It's not a real gun in the truest sense of the word. You've got one cartridge and you've had to fiddle around with the bullet. Bullet itself was interfered with in the sense of where the bullet was placed in the casing was crimped. Those features detracted from it being what we perceived as the professional, organized strike against someone. And you just got the one bullet. That's not how, even with the Trident killings, a London investigation team which looked at black gang culture, drugs culture, and the investigation of those killings, which was separate. They were multiple shots. You can go around anywhere, not just England. If you want to kill someone, you're going to fire more than once, because how do you know you're going to hit them? How do you know you're going to incapacitate them? Here was someone going up, shooting them in the head and pushing them to the ground. So there was all these features which constantly replayed itself in the analysis of the crime scene, and experts giving this view and that view. And I thought, I don't know, it didn't strike to me when I wrote that there was this dilemma between what appeared at first flush, the professional assassination, for want of a better word, and actually something more mundane and straightforward. That's where we were with it. And the evidence, you asked, what's the actual evidence? The evidence was the gun and the methodology of the shooting and the walking away afterwards. I don't know if you could walk away. You could do all the things that we say which might detract, could equally be used to say, well, there we are. That's the dilemma with stranger homicide.
Hamish, there were so many theories at the time about the motive behind Jill's murder. Was it a contract killer, a former lover, a TV rival, a Serbian terrorist angry with a televised appeal that Jill had made for Kosovan war victims, perhaps a criminal that she'd exposed on Crimewatch, or a troubled former patient of her fiancé who was a doctor?
Yeah.
Where were you in your head about the motive yourself? Because it sounds like all of this was going through your mind, and the strange paradox about the method of the killing. When you were sitting there racking your brain for what on earth had happened, what were your thoughts, Hamish?
So I wrote formal notes in the decision logs, in the Metropolitan Police decision logs, which all forces use to actually articulate what are we doing and why are we doing it. And then separately, I had a little electronic diary in those days. And I wrote just my personal thoughts. And I wrote then, I'm looking at it myself, Mark's probably got them in the book there. I wrote, my initial thoughts remain much the same. The loner stroke obsessive or the organised gang or individual. And I wrote, I feel it is criminal as opposed to Serbian or political, which was even being raised then in May. There is something about it which is so clinical, yet the weapon and ammunition tell me crime and not professional. And later on I wrote, and I had become over time thinking, no, this doesn't seem to me, not how I perceived it from my understanding of this crime scene and my experience elsewhere. But in the end, it wasn't just my experience. It was other detectives with me and other senior detectives who came in to review the matter. It wasn't an isolationist program running like some TV program where the detective runs off on their own with all the ideas. That was simply not it. Every day we had meetings and discussions on it. And then senior officers came in for the reviews and also then contributed. And I mean, helpfully contributing, say, what about this? Can we think about that? And then we did have Adrian West, a clinical psychologist, who also provided support later on. So there was a lot of thinking to the process. But if you ask me, what did I have in my belief? It was an individual event. I thought the whole scenario in itself presented as, lucky strike's the wrong phrase, but a set of circumstances which arrive to suspect and victim meeting up. And it happens time and time again across murder scenes everywhere, whether it's the stabbing victim or whatever. I didn't see her as the target. We used to argue, well, has she been killed because she's a female? Females get killed. Has she been killed because she was about to go into a house and they wanted to rob her? Was this the start of a failed home invasion? All these options came up to think, well, let's just look at that. What was she even doing there? This is the analysis. We charted everything and mapped it out, and the analyst doing it. Why was Jill at that house at that time of day, on that day? Where did she live and what were her movements? We had her movements down to every hour for 3 months, all of that year, in fact, and even the year before. So we could see every movement. We could see the alarm code on her house, who operated the alarm code, her, the cleaner, and there was one other person. When they went in, when they went out. That sort of timing, and then think, right, if you really had all that, if you had placed her under observation for so long, that is not the place you would shoot her. She was hardly ever there.
Hamish, you've given us very generously an indication of what notes you were taking at the time over a long period. And of course, this did go on without a suspect. I remember you wrote at the 9-month point that you were really, really puzzled. There'd been so much publicity, so much money on offer as a reward. You couldn't, according to your notes, really believe that you weren't making the progress that you thought you would. Do you remember your thoughts at the time?
We did think it was extraordinary. I thought it was extraordinary. And I felt that we'd missed something. And it was £250,000. It's no secret, the Metropolitan Police and everyone else, the intelligence agencies are listening to people all the time. Organised gangs are observed and listened to, I put that nicely, over many things. So it's not like on the 26th of April 1999, we weren't listening to organised gang groups and other people. There was nothing. We had all the intelligence available and provided if necessary. So unless someone didn't tell us, then what can I do? But we formally asked, we went, the intelligence services as well, to say, all right, if this is really the other world of organised gang, political interference, terrorism, then there would like to be something, 250,000. There was nothing. So I did really wonder about it. And I sensed we needed to go back and look again at what we got in the first weeks and months. I've done other murders and I'm interested in homicide in itself. And so much of investigations in these types, so much information comes into a system. Of course, it can be overlooked or even missed. And I felt that the answer perhaps lay in going back into looking at that first month. And in my formal logs, I wrote, we need to go back and look again at what we got within those first weeks and months, because perhaps there was something there which we'd overlooked.
The idea of the lone stalker was, I remember from the time, supported by consulting psychologists you use. You talked about Adrian West, who was working with you. They tried to establish a criminal profile of the killer, like those ideas pioneered by the FBI's behavioural science unit to catch serial killers. Did they help you narrow your search? And I'm thinking particularly of, you sent a couple of detectives to California to interview J. Reed Malloy.
Yes.
I went to interview him as well. How was he able to narrow down your potential suspects?
Well, it's a good question, but to be honest, he didn't in one way. In fact, I can remember Adrian West thinking that we were still looking in the wrong direction, because we did focus a lot of our inquiries in those months between April and through to December on various organized groups and named and known criminals. He thought we were wasting our time, but it didn't stop me then. We got to look at this because there's information or intelligence, wrong or right, which we can't ignore. What Adrian West did, and I think others, it wasn't so much a profile of a person to identify. It wasn't like that. I never proceeded like that. What he did for us is to develop thinking to try to interpret the crime scene. It's a further mind looking at it to think, well, what's the type of person? Yes, but knowing the type of a person doesn't help you go to which name is this? Out of all the thousands of names, which one will that be? It doesn't do that for you. It just helps to make you see things differently or from a different angle. And the interpretation of this FBI world, was this a disorganized killing? Was it an organized killing in terms of human behavior at the crime scene? What is their evidence disposal like? Well, pretty poor if you want to leave the casing behind and can't help the bullet. I don't suppose they thought the bullet would pass through the brain, but the casing was left there. So I think that's where Adrian was extremely beneficial. He did write a report which gave an indication of the type of individual he thought may be responsible. But you couldn't use it to go, well, that's him, if you see what I mean. It didn't detract from, no, we've still got to do these lines of inquiry. We've still got this information coming in. Because after April, May, June, somewhere else is in the logs, the greater majority of the crime scene had been resolved. We got every photograph, we got every bit of forensic that could be extracted and squeezed from every which way. The house scene had been done. We got every witness who was likely to be possibly used in a court. In fact, funnily enough, a year later, the witnesses who came forward for ID parade were witnesses who we had identified within the first weeks, but they were part of the original trawl. So the months following June, July, August were about suspect elimination. And Adrian helped us to try to think, well, look at Jill's immediate partners' time frame, ex-partners, within a 2-year frame. And then now let's look at some of the ex-boyfriends, what I call the inner circle, then that slightly outer circle, and then this vast pool of thousands of individuals who were just named. And that's when we were fairly ruthless in the end to say, well, look, some of these people naming an individual for someone in London who's never been to London, this wasn't making sense. And that's the trouble with, as in many other stranger large cases which receive so much publicity, everyone has an opinion and everyone has a view and nominates individuals. So we had to be quite strict with our criteria.
One of the fascinating aspects, as you were trying to find a suspect, was Jill Dando's physical resemblance to Princess Diana.
Yes.
Now, that was obvious to the media, to fans of Jill Dando.
Yes, I read that.
But also it was something that was picked up by the psychologist that you sent your staff to talk to in California.
Malloy.
I remember talking to J. Reed Malloy some years later, and he explained to me something called erotomania, a recognised mental illness in which someone develops an imaginary relationship with the object of their obsession. And Malloy said, and I'm sure he told your detectives this, that a news presenter like Dando is vulnerable to these obsessives because, unlike film actresses, they look directly into the camera and cultivate an open one-to-one relationship with viewers. And if you've got on the end of the TV screen, the other end, and a deluded obsessive with you, then that creates all sorts of problems for the object of their desire. How important was that analysis?
It was a valid point, and it was part of my thinking or direction. That's perhaps where the answer lay in terms of this individual. Of course, you're back to the same question, well, which individual? We understand it might be someone who's somehow fixated or over-obsessed with Jill Dando. And there was one individual, I remember him, he was clearly quite fixated on Jill Dando. He had contacted the BBC, he had written to her, he had even delivered letters by hand to 29 Gowan Avenue. And the BBC security manager at the time, we went to see him, and he accepted that he had done these things, but he certainly wasn't in either the age range or capability or motor function to be able to have conducted that crime. in terms of somebody running away from the scene. He was a somewhat elderly man. But it was interesting. Here was a man who had written, and we thought, well, no, that's the type of person. And then that's why we went to the Crimewatch and Jill's diaries and the letter writers. I mean, it must have been 12,000 emails or letters to Jill over the time that she'd received. Well, who were they? The greater majority were, "Dear Jill, we love your program, we love you. Keep on doing the good work," sort of thing. But could there have been in that something else which identified? But there wasn't, in terms of, the repeat writer, someone with the same address. So Malloy's point was correct. Adrian Westbrook had the same sort of thing. The team had divergent views. It was actually made for a very healthy debate. I remember one detective constable saying, so either just before or just after Jill had been murdered, before anybody had been arrested, the dress designer Versace had been killed. And I remember him saying, so look at Versace. Everyone thought it was going to be some hit and everything else, but it just turns out to be some sad individual with his own internal dynamics. And then we started listing Claudia Schiffer. She also had been the subject of stalking and attack. And then we started thinking, well, actually, yes, why are we obsessed with this? Of course, the reason couldn't shake, it's got to be a professional hit, was the link to the Bosnian War and the bombing of the Belgrade TV station some days before. So that was always in the background. But all the other Russian mafia, crime watch, drugs dealing, paedophile, all those other criminal things. We had many from West London gangs, North London gangs. It's a punishment. It's to teach her this or what. That was, I'm sorry, but that was just utter misleading nonsense.
Then in mid-2000, you had what seemed like a breakthrough. Somebody was brought to your attention who perhaps fitted that psychological profile that you were looking for.
Yes, we did. The person who came to our attention was a man called Barry Bulsara, or Paul Gadd. And of course, that man, Barry Bulsara, Paul Gadd, was Barry George. We had a number of different names, but his initial names was what we started the work on to then discover who he really was. Amongst those diary notes or the extracts I provided you, I write here, he is a suspect and the most significant I've seen in this inquiry so far. And then I write here, I cannot detail all the history of this individual, but loner, obsessive, category, gun enthusiast, modified weapons, a follower, a hater of women, tentative, but I've actually written here very little link to Jill after death, access to the scene, no alibi. So I listed all these things from when he first came in under that name, Bulsara / Gadd. It's not a secret. I thought, well, after a year and a half, all this is emerging. And when they went to the house the first time, he was just an initial trace interview eliminate, because we realized he was the person who had been named in messages coming back in May 99. Here we are coming in 2000, and recovered from his house many rolls, hundreds of rolls of undeveloped film. I can remember going into the exhibits room and saying, oh, what's happened with that search? Because at that time, it was just another search. We didn't do many, so it was, I well knew it. And they said, oh, so we've got all these rolls of film. And I thought, well, that's thing. What's on them? And they had developed them, of course. And the photographs just showed hundreds and hundreds of women. And I thought, that is really odd. To me, that was a surprise, because I wasn't thinking like that in terms of, we have this individual who's been named by individuals who called us a year ago. We go to his house, and then you find an empty gun holster, and this film's undeveloped. But then, right, what is it you're photographing? Women. Hundreds and hundreds of women, mostly from behind, of course, because he's not looking at them on photograph. And then one or two of them were in Gowan Avenue. I thought, well, this is odd. This is more than odd. And then that's what jettisoned the inquiry even to a further step, whilst other inquiries were going on with other people at the same time. So yes, the information which came in at the time, and after a year, it looked highly suspicious and meritorious of going forward.
And you say that his name came in May, so within 2 or 3 weeks of Jill's murder. Do you think you were wrong not to have pursued him more closely at the time?
Well, it was unfortunate, about wrong. But the funny thing is, there was an anonymous message on the day of the murder, which came in, not naming anybody, but saying there is an odd man at an address in Crookham Road. Now, that was an anonymous message which was not followed through. And then weeks later came the messages, 2 separate messages, one from a taxi company the next day, the 27th of April, talking about an unknown man, an unusual man who came in wanting a lift, talking about the murder and asking the taxi manager, can you remember what I was wearing? I was wearing this. And then another message from a local authority disability centre. They called. They didn't give the name George. They gave another name. With reference to the taxi company, see, that was followed up immediately. That was a very interesting conversation that he'd had. And we seized the taxi. I remember taking the witness from the taxi driver, seeing where the taxi went to see where he's dropped off, and couldn't follow it up. That was left in abeyance, unsolved. Who was the man who got into that taxi? That man, of course, was the same person who had visited the disability centre, either on the day or the day after. I forget right now the precise details. And that was the one that was not followed up immediately. And that was an error. That was disappointing. But it was not part of the, at the time, the criteria, because the first call, they didn't give us the detail. They said there's a man, and that was it. And then another member of the same organisation either rang up before Crimewatch or just after the first Crimewatch and said, look, you need to know about this person. And I don't know if they then gave the real name, but there was a third call sometime later. So that's where it slipped through, and it wasn't recognised until we went back. Right or wrong, whoever it is, we've missed something in connecting these dots with this individual, and then realised actually the man at the disability centre who was seeking the same sort of questions, what was I wearing, what am I doing, was the same person who went to the taxi office. And those messages had not been, obviously, because different names, different address, linked, but they were linked by December, January, to which allowed the officer who got, go and look for this man again, because now we've got a name from the disability. And that's when he went and tried to track down what was then still Bulsara Gad, George. He did research, the constable, the detective constable, on this man. And that's when we found he wasn't on the computer. He was under old records. And the Metropolitan Police, years before, had dispensed with and archived all the local criminal records, like what we called the collators records. So a vast amount of data was sitting on collators cards, not on the police national computer. And that is where the real intelligence came from about it. So he had dug those out. They were still in the police station, down in the basement. And then we could see the full background to George.
Hamish, we'll park this first episode on that thought, the cliffhanger you've left us on there, and thank you for your insight so far. In our next episode of Who Murdered Jill Dando, also featuring former Chief Superintendent Hamish Campbell, we'll explore the case against Barry George, from the police station to the courtroom, and find out why he was convicted and then later acquitted. We'll also look at alternative theories about the crime and potential advances in forensic technology which might one day bring Jill Dando's killer to justice. And what do you remember about the case as listeners? Let us know your thoughts. Hey listeners, True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.